Hello, and welcome to this in-between episode of the Indie Author Podcast. I wanted to put out this in-between episode to give you an update on the Google Play AI narrated audiobook I just did for the Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors. And for those of you who are watching on video, I thought that since I'm the guest of this episode, I'd record it using my guest rather than my host background. And I also just had this set up in place because I just got finished recording a webinar on podcasting for authors for Brian Burney's Fiction Marketing Academy, which is coming right up on May 16th, 2022, running through May 20th. And I'll just put in a quick plug for Brian's event here. One of the best ways to fast track your path to selling more books is to put yourself in a virtual room with people who know what they're talking about, then tap their expertise to create your own recipe for success, kind of like a dessert buffet. If you'd like to hear what top experts in book marketing are saying about the best ways to sell more of your fiction, claim your free Fiction Marketing Academy ticket. And you can go to theindieauthor.com/affiliates if you'd like to use my affiliate link to sign up and to hear me talk about what podcasting has to offer for authors. The other resource that is now available to you to find out more about podcasting for authors is my new audiobook of the Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors, narrated quite ably by AI narrator Michelle. And here's a quick sample.
As the host of the Indie Author Podcast, podcasting for authors is a topic I can speak to from firsthand experience, and I'll offer several perspectives that I believe will resonate with my fellow authors. First, I believe that for many of us, a podcast is not an end in itself, but a route to a larger goal, specifically establishing connections within the writing and publishing worlds and building a community with listeners.
That was way better than any other text-to-speech app or service I've tested. And although it isn't quite up to a performance, which I want for my fiction, I find it is completely listenable when my goal is to convey information or to get information if I'm the listener. At the moment, I'm still using a human narrator for my fiction, but I will be very interested to see how Google improves the AI's performance abilities since I've been having some trouble getting on my human narrator's calendar. So here's my experience with the process of creating the audiobook. First of all, the Google Play instructions. The instructions that Google Play provides are pretty clear, but they're not very thorough. And Michael Aran, who just published the AI narrated version of Indie Author Confidential, Volume 1, Secrets No One Will Tell You About Being a Writer, was very gracious about filling in some of the blanks. And I thought I'd share some of Google's instructions here. I'll include a link to this in the show notes. So first of all, Google says, get started with auto-narrated audiobooks. Create an audiobook from an English or Spanish ebook with the auto-narrated audiobook tool. You can create auto-narration if you own the audio rights to the title. The ebook is written in English or Spanish. The book is in an EPUB file format, and your account offers the ebook on Google Play. Auto-narrated audiobooks use a digital voice to read ebooks. Auto-narration works best on nonfiction titles, so even Google recognizes that it's not quite up to performance of fiction yet. Availability. Auto-narrated audiobooks are available to publishers in these countries and regions: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Spain, United Kingdom, and United States. And auto-narrated audiobooks can be sold wherever you have the rights to sell the book. And then Google goes on to provide some information about what to click on to create the audiobook from the EPUB. And when I initially uploaded, the audiobook narration text pulls from the EPUB for your ebook. But once you've created the audiobook from the EPUB, you can't upload a new file. You have to manually correct or enter text. And if I'd known this in advance, I would have done a more thorough cleanup of the text, updated the Google Play ebook EPUB, and then created the audiobook. If you're looking for a great description of the mechanics of moving content from platform to platform, for example, Vellum, Word, Scrivener, Pro Writing Aid, and so on, this is not specific to audiobook creation, but it is very useful. Check out the Creative Pen podcast episode titled Rewriting My First Novel After More Than a Decade, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. I found in my case, it was easiest just to update Vellum and then copy and paste the updated content chapter by chapter. Although I have to say I always find making any changes to content in Vellum a little nerve-wracking. It's really not designed for that. So in terms of updates to the content, I had to remove some chapters that the automated upload pulled over from my ebook. So I removed the title page, the table of contents. I also removed the Also by Maddie Dalrymple page because I thought that would just sound weird read out. I replaced the copyright page with one specific to the AI narrated audiobook. And I also removed the resources list, which is helpful if you're reading it, but also would have sounded weird if it had been read out by the AI narrator. And I added new opening and closing credits. And I actually borrowed the text from these from the Michael Laron AI narrated audiobook. Michael has a law degree, so I figured he knew what he was doing when he put together that text. I removed any of the characters that would be read oddly by AI narration, including opening and closing angle brackets. So the AI narrator would read those as greater than or less than. And that was kind of a pain because in a lot of cases, I had represented a path that I wanted print readers to follow on my website. I would say theindyauthor.com, and I would put space, greater than angle bracket, space, and then the name of the page I wanted them to go to, like Podcasting for Authors. But the AI read that as theindyauthor.com, greater than Podcasting for Authors. So that wasn't too good. Also slashes, I tried to avoid those. And just note that you can't change that in all cases. For example, if you have a slash in the middle of a URL, you don't want to remove that. So you can't use global search and replace to do that. You have to look for each case individually. And I also did things like I removed EG and replaced it with, for example, individually based on the context, and replaced IE with, in other words, or whatever made sense in that context. I also included in the updated content in both the audiobook and the ebook and print book a reference to my author podcasting consulting service, because I'm starting to think of Podcasting for Authors to be more like a business card to my consulting offerings, more so than having it be a significant income earner on its own. And I did a couple of other content edits that I had been queuing up. For example, information on the benefits of hiring someone to do cleanup on transcripts, and also expanded information about video opportunities related to podcasting. And I also used the opportunity of revisiting the content to run it through ProWriting Aid, and found some stylistic and content improvements to make on the basis of that. So going back to the Google instructions, it does give you information on editing the audiobook, editing the audio file, reviewing the content. It gives you information about uploading a cover image. I had actually not gotten a Square audiobook image when I got the cover for Podcasting for Authors done. I got the print and ebook covers, but not the Square audio. And so that's a lesson learned for me. Just ask your cover designer for a Square version, just in case, because it will be easy and inexpensive for them to do it all at once. But if you're watching video, if not, I'll just describe it to you. The cover is such that it was very easy for me to just condense it into a Square format on Canva. It has the Indie Author's Guide 2 at the top, and then sort of in the middle, it has Podcasting for Authors and the subtitle. And then at the bottom, it has my name. And so by just removing some of the blank space between the Indie Author's Guide to the main part of the title, and then the blank space between the subtitle and my author name, I was able to quite easily make a Square version myself using Canva. And I'll also share some of the tips that Google provides to create a better auto-narrated audiobook experience. So here's what Google has to say. Editorial: forewords, afterwords, and passages provide the writer's name at the beginning of the section. Imagery: edit or remove references to charts, diagrams, tables, and long lists. And footnotes should get removed automatically. Manually remove any footnotes that were missed. And then some general notes on auto narration and interpretation. Narrator accents: some words may be pronounced differently based on the narrator's accent. For example, Kinglouis sounds like King Louis in US English and King Louis in British English. Narrator language: to create audiobooks, it's best to use a narrator in the same language as your ebook. If you use a narrator that doesn't match the ebook's language, it can result in mispronounced words. Homographs: some words like read, minute, and present have more than one pronunciation, and within the editor, you can modify the audio text to represent a phonetic spelling, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, how that played out for me. More languages: audiobooks are narrated in one language. If a book has text like a quote or phrase in another language, the text gets pronounced in the main language. Uncommon abbreviations: spell out uncommon abbreviations like in names, WM period for William, or units of measure, CWT for hundredweight or S for shillings. Spell those out. Punctuation: good punctuation improves the narration. Instead of a dash to represent characters, use the full word or use the word blank, as in D blanket. And line breaks create pauses in the narration. So here's how I handled that. My goal was to keep the text of the ebook and the audiobook as similar as possible. For example, I changed EG to example in both. I didn't make that change just in the audiobook, but there were some changes I needed to make only in the audio version. And you can correct some pronunciations by looking up the phonetic spelling online and then copying that phonetic spelling into the script. But here are the ones I changed. So content, most of the places where I reference the word content, I want the narration to say content. And in many cases it did, but there were a couple where it said content. And I was able to fix that just by putting in CON in capitals, CON capitals, and then -tent. Patrons, I had to spell out, it got Patreon right, it got patron right, but if I had patrons with an apostrophe S, it mispronounced it. So in that case, I spelled it out as capital PAY and then lowercase TRINS. Ally, as in the Alliance of Independent Authors, it didn't know how to pronounce ally, spelled ALLI, so I just changed all those to ALLY. Blubrry, the podcasting platform, which is spelled BLUBRRY, I just wrote out as Blubrry. Outro, it would pronounce as outrow, and I was able to fix that by respelling it as capital O, capital W, lowercase TRO. Snafus, I tried a bunch of different ways of trying to get it to say snafus rather than snafus. And that's one where I looked up snafus and I got the phonetic spelling that did work. There was a phrase that was, some of my followers read the transcript. And of course, read was spelled READ, but I had to respell it REED to get the narration to read it correctly. There was a quote from Dale Roberts where the text is, Maddie is a promotional machine. Wow. Both of those with exclamation points. And Maddie is a promotional machine sounded okay in the AI narration, but wow, it just was rendered in a very sort of deadpan way. So I just took wow out in the audiobook version. There are also a number of quotes at the beginning of the chapters, all nautically based. And so there was one that said, it's the set of the sails and not the gales which determines the way it goes. But in the text, which starts a new line, but there was such a long pause, as Google warned us there would be by a line break, that I just took out the paragraph break so that it read that straight through. And then another word that a couple of places got wrong, and I could never figure out how to correct it, was record. So it would say record. And I tried various versions, lowercase re, uppercase CORD. Everything I tried, it just would say record. So in a couple of places, I just finally decided to let it go. My recommendation here is make a note of the entire phrases in which you're making corrections in case you need to clean up after another copying and pasting in a future update, because you can't really just search for all occurrences of content and replace it with a phonetic spelling. The context is important, so you really have to look at each individual phrase in order to make sure you're making the right corrections in future updates. And the correction process turned out to be more tedious than I think it needs to be, because if you change anything in a sentence, the readback always starts at the beginning of the sentence. And I couldn't find a way to make it play back any faster than 1.5 speed. So that was a slow and kind of painful process. Just a quick break from the interview. Are you getting value from the podcast? Please consider supporting it and all the work I do at The Indie Author by becoming a patron. To pledge a monthly contribution, go to patreon.com/The Indie Author, or to make an occasional contribution, perhaps to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage, scroll to the bottom of any page at theindieauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. And now, back to the interview. Then Google provides in their instructions how to download your auto-narrated audiobook. And once you've completed all that and approved it, then you're ready to sell it on Google Play. I will say that I put AI narrated in several places, including on the cover, in the description, all the places I could think of where a potential listener would be finding out about it. I included AI narrated because I don't want to take anyone by surprise about that. And then finally, one of the nice things is you can download the files from Google Play and you can sell them elsewhere. They belong to you. And so Google says publishers can sell auto-narrated audiobooks on any retail platform that allows them. Many don't. After publishing the auto-narrated audiobook on Google Play Books, the publisher will be able to download the audio files. However, if the auto-narrated audiobook is for sale elsewhere, it must also be for sale on Google Play Books. And I tried to do some research on my own about where else you could sell them. And I finally got what I thought was an authoritative response from Erin Wright of Wide for the Win. And she said, as long as you clearly mark that the audiobook is AI generated, Kobo will allow it. As far as I know, only Kobo and Google Play allow them, at least at this moment. I imagine this will change over time as AI audiobooks become more popular. And this is in May of 2022 for anyone who's listening to this in the future. So now I have the downloaded files, and in my ongoing email chat with Michael Laron, where he was being so helpful, the downloaded files don't have a common sense name. They don't match the names of the files that are in Google Play, like Chapter 1, Chapter 2. They have some weird Google Play assigned download name. So Michael said, the good old chapter renaming. The answer is super techy, but no, I didn't rename them manually. I'll spare you the details unless you really want them. They're kind of complicated. You have to update both the file names and the ID3 tags, which is really time consuming if you have a lot of chapters. And he graciously offered to help me out. I probably shouldn't be saying this. Please don't everybody get in touch with Michael Laron asking him to do this for you. He asked for an Excel file with all the chapter names in sequential order, as well as the cover art. And he actually made those changes for me. So thank you again, Michael, for doing that. So I'm very, very excited about this opportunity. I think it's going to make a ton of content available, well, to listeners. I mean, think of all the people who could be benefiting from this content who are not able to because they can't read the books. And so it's a huge boon for visually impaired people, and it's a huge boon for indie authors who can start making this content available. So I thought I'd share the first chapter of the Indie Author's Guide to Podcasting for Authors here to give you a fuller sense of what AI narration offers. Please leave a comment on YouTube and let me know what you think, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So here is Michelle from Google Play Books.
To anyone contemplating a voyage, I would say go. Joshua Slocum. As those of you who listen to the Indie Author podcast or have read my nonfiction work will know, I love using the nautical metaphor to explore the writing craft and the publishing voyage, so the Joshua Slocum quote is perfect for this book. If you are contemplating embarking on the podcasting voyage, I would say go, and in this chapter we'll explore the reasons why. Why is podcasting a platform that authors should consider? Audio content is portable in a way that visual content is not. It caters to our crazily busy lives by enabling people to enjoy content while commuting to work, walking the dog, or folding the laundry. The technology to enable this access is expanding and improving every year. Consider the ease with which you can sync your phone to your car's audio system and the explosion of the use of home audio technology such as smart speakers. Podcasting is a key facet of this audio-centric evolution. 75% of Americans are now familiar with podcasting, and 55% have listened to a podcast. 37% of Americans listen to podcasts monthly, a number which has grown 54% in 3 years. Weekly podcast listeners tune in to an average of 6 podcasts per week. As impressive as these statistics are, their focus on the U.S. audience understates the potential global reach podcasts offer. Of course, there have to be plenty of podcasts out there to meet such demand. 850,000 active podcasts and over 30 million podcast episodes. Your initial reaction might be, with that many podcasts, what's the use of launching a new one? That's where our author mindset comes into play. As of mid-2020, there were over 6 million Kindle ebooks on Amazon, but we would never have become authors if our reaction to that statistic was to say, if readers already have 6 million books to choose from, why should I add more to the pool? We write our books and offer them to our readers because we're convinced that by honing our skills in our writing craft and by developing a professional approach to our publishing voyage, our efforts will enable our books to find an audience of enthusiastic readers. As with books, so with podcasts. By developing skills in the craft of podcasting and by bringing a level of professionalism to the podcasting voyage, our efforts will enable us to find an audience of enthusiastic listeners. In this book, I'll share my hard-won knowledge and experience in order to smooth your voyage into the waters of podcasting.